August 24th, 1944, Wendover Field, Utah. The wind tore across the salt flats as another silver B-29 Superfortress lumbered down the runway. Its four Wright R-3350 engines screamed under the strain, each coughing plumes of blue exhaust into the dawn. Inside the cockpit, sweat dripped from Colonel Paul Tibbets's brow as he wrestled the yoke, watching the fuel gauges twitch too fast, too uneven. The aircraft shuddered as the left inboard engine sputtered, its fuel pressure collapsing. "We're losing pressure again," the flight engineer shouted over the intercom. Tibbets cursed, throttling back. The bomber's nose dipped, its 141-foot wings trembling under the strain. For a machine built to reach Japan, it barely managed to circle the base. On the tarmac, a quiet figure stood alone with a clipboard, a civilian in oil-stained overalls. His name was Harold Farley, an unassuming Boeing engineer. He wasn't a pilot, a general, or a strategist. But as he watched the Superfortress fight against its own design, he saw what others didn't: the hidden flaw buried in the way its wings drank fuel. That night, while others blamed engines and altitude, Farley began sketching a new idea, one that would double the range of America's most ambitious bomber. Harold Farley's desk sat in a forgotten corner of Boeing's experimental division, a cramped space between crates of rivets and a drafting table worn smooth by years of graphite sketches. Most engineers working on the B-29 were consumed by the urgent demands of war deadlines, production quotas, and the pressure of building a bomber that could leap the Pacific. But Farley's obsession was quieter, almost invisible. It was about drag weight and the unseen turbulence of air and fuel inside those massive wings. The Superfortress on paper was a marvel: pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and four powerful Wright engines. Yet in flight, it suffered. Pilots reported fuel starvation during climbs, tanks that drained unevenly, and constant trim adjustments to counterbalance the shifting load. Each gallon of fuel, sloshing inside the wings, subtly changed the aircraft's shape in the air, creating drag no one could see, but every crew could feel. Farley noticed patterns others ignored. In the flight logs, he saw how left and right tanks burned at mismatched rates. The design forced fuel pumps to fight gravity and airflow at high altitudes, creating surges that starved the inboard engines while the outer tanks remained heavy. The more pilots compensated, the more resistance they created. Every adjustment cost range, and every mile lost meant fewer targets reachable over Japan. Most engineers blamed the Wright engines, notorious for overheating and failures. Boeing blamed the Army Air Forces for pushing the aircraft too fast into production. But Farley, buried under technical memos and test data, found something else: the shape of the problem. In his sketches, he mapped the wing's internal plumbing, a tangle of aluminum tubes, valves, and pumps, and realized that the system moved fuel like a farmer moving water through an uneven field. It was inefficient and, worse, asymmetrical. The B-29 carried nearly 9,500 gallons of fuel, yet only 80% of it flowed freely at cruising altitude. The rest pooled, trapped in slow-draining cells that changed the bomber's center of lift. At first, his colleagues laughed. A junior draftsman called it Farley's ghost drag, a problem no instrument could measure. But Farley persisted. He borrowed flight test reports, engine temperature logs, even pilot complaints scribbled in margins, notes like "fuel pressure flickers after climb" or "right bank feels heavy at cruise." He compiled them into a single hypothesis: the B-29 wasn't failing because of its engines, but because its wings were fighting themselves. He proposed a new system, a wing fuel distribution manifold that allowed even flow across tanks using gravity-assisted feed and balanced pump pressure. The concept was simple: let the aircraft breathe evenly. Instead of forcing pumps to move fuel uphill through restrictive lines, he rerouted the system to flow with the aircraft's natural tilt in flight, It was elegant, lightweight, and most importantly required no major redesign of the airframe. When he brought the idea to his supervisor, the reaction was predictable. "You're not on the propulsion team," Harold said, Chief Engineer Frank Carroll barely glancing up. "We're building a bomber, not a laboratory." But Farley refused to let the idea die. Late at night, he stayed behind after test flights, examining fuel strainers and vent lines, tracing their paths like a detective reconstructing a crime. He discovered tiny air pockets forming during climb bubbles that disrupted flow, creating a pressure imbalance across tanks. His manifold could equalize it automatically. It would not just improve efficiency, it would stabilize the entire aircraft. By early 1944, Farley had assembled a small team of sympathetic mechanics to test a prototype on a grounded B-29 fuselage. They drilled, welded, and connected new fuel lines by hand, hiding their work under the cover of routine maintenance. When they fired up the engines for a static run, something extraordinary happened. The fuel pressure needles held steady. No sputtering, no uneven drain. Farley's quiet triumph, however, arrived at the wrong time. The Army Air Forces were already shipping B-29s to bases in India for operations over Burma. There was no patience for design tweaks, not when generals demanded results, but word began to spread among test crews at Boeing Field. Pilots noticed smoother climbs, more stable power settings, and slightly longer endurance on modified aircraft. It wasn't official, but it was undeniable. The engineer no one listened to had discovered the hidden flaw that limited America's greatest bomber. And soon, when the war's geography shifted, that overlooked breakthrough would decide whether the Pacific campaign could reach Japan at all. Spring 1944, the Pacific had become a chessboard of coral airstrips and smoldering islands. From Saipan to Tinian, the US was building runways long enough to host the B-29, the only bomber capable of reaching Japan's heartland. But there was a brutal truth whispered among engineers and pilots alike. The range numbers didn't add up. Even under ideal conditions, the Superfortress could barely cross 1,500 miles with a combat payload. Tokyo lay more than 1,500 miles from the nearest US base, and crosswinds, engine wear, or even minor inefficiencies could mean the difference between making it home or ditching in the Pacific. Commanders argued, mathematicians recalculated, and generals demanded miracles. In a windowless hangar in Wichita, Harold Farley's quiet idea began its second life. An Air Material Command liaison, Captain Robert Harmon, had seen one of the modified test planes and noted its performance: slightly longer range, smoother balance, and less vibration. Harmon sent a memo directly to Boeing's engineering division: recommend immediate review of Farley manifold for operational integration. No one at the time realized that memo would change the course of the air war. The Pacific climate was unforgiving. Tropical heat warped fuel tanks. High-altitude icing caused vapor lock. The B-29's engines devoured oil faster than crews could replenish it. And yet, despite these challenges, the aircraft's fate hinged on one thing: endurance. To reach Japan from the new bases being carved out in the Mariana Islands, the Superfortress would need to fly at its absolute maximum with no margin for inefficiency. In July, as Seabees blasted coral into dust and bulldozers scraped flat the volcanic earth of Tinian, Boeing engineers received a classified order from Washington: implement range improvement modifications to B-29 Fleet Priority Code Red. Farley's design had been quietly approved. It started as a whisper among the ground crews. Maintenance men noticed new tubing snaking through the wings junctions, stamped with serial numbers that didn't match standard issue. The new manifold system was subtle, but the results were not. On test flights, fuel burn stabilized. Long-range calibration runs stretched further than anyone had predicted. A bomber that once sputtered over Saipan now soared toward Tokyo on the same tank of gas. Still, the Pacific skies were merciless. In one test sortie, Captain Harmon himself rode along, clipboard in hand. As they climbed past 28,000 feet, the engines roared at full-power propellers, biting into thin air. The crew braced for the usual turbulence, that bone-deep vibration that shook rivets loose and made gauges dance. But it never came. The plane flew steady, smooth its weight, balanced perfectly across the wings. "Feels like she's gliding," the co-pilot murmured. Harmon checked the flow meters. Equal pressure, equal draw, perfect symmetry. The engineer's idea wasn't a theory anymore. It was physics in motion. Thousands of miles away in Guam, General Curtis LeMay pored over flight reports. The numbers were startling. Aircraft fitted with the new manifold returned with reserve fuel still in their tanks. Range had increased by nearly 20%, a small miracle that translated to hundreds of extra miles. Enough to make Tokyo vulnerable. In the war rooms, strategy maps were redrawn. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam would become the springboards for the final phase of the Pacific campaign. But none of it would have been possible without the invisible engineering buried inside those wings. When Farley was informed of the deployment order, he didn't celebrate. He simply sat at his desk staring at the memo signed by the US Army Air Forces. His idea, once dismissed as trivial, would now be standard across the B-29 fleet. There would be no medals, no promotions, no front-page headlines, just the quiet satisfaction that his machine would carry men further than they'd ever gone before. By late October 1944, the first combat-ready B-29s rolled onto Tinian's newly finished runway. Mechanics wiped dust from the aluminum skin, pilots checked fuel pressure, and flight engineers whispered silent prayers. Overhead, the tropical sky shimmered blue and endless, a vast ocean of air that until now had always been just out of reach. What none of them yet knew was that Farley's modification, born in a cluttered workshop thousands of miles away, would soon carry them over Tokyo's burning skyline. November 24th, 1944. Tinian Airfield, Mariana Islands. The morning sun broke over the volcanic ridges as the first wave of B-29s prepared for takeoff. Mechanics tightened fuel caps, checked valve pressures, and inspected the shimmering network of aluminum pipes that now ran beneath the wings. Each bomber carried a name: Dauntless Dottie Eddie Allen's Revenge. The ramp, tramp painted in bold letters that would soon vanish into clouds over the Pacific. At the head of the runway, Colonel Emmett Rosie O'Donnell watched his flight crew strap in. The mission to bomb the Nakajima Aircraft Works in Tokyo, over 1,500 miles away. It was the first direct assault on Japan from the newly captured islands, a test of range endurance and nerve. Many doubted the Superfortress could make it there and back. Inside Dauntless, Dottie, the fuel system hummed like a living thing. The new manifold, installed quietly by Boeing's field engineers, distributed flow with surgical precision. Fuel pumps balanced their draw, transferring weight evenly as the aircraft climbed through layers of humid air. For the first time, the Superfortress didn't groan under its own imbalance. It ascended. At 7:00 a.m., the formation thundered into the sky, 111 bombers in gleaming silver rows. Their shadows swept over the lagoon and coral reefs as they banked toward the open Pacific. The air crews had no idea they were testing the limits of both machine and man. Hours into the mission, the tropics faded into nothing but endless blue. Inside the pressurized cabin, the air grew thin and dry. Frost formed on the gun turrets. The flight engineer monitored the fuel gauges, expecting the usual erratic fluctuations. Instead, the needles held steady, unwavering. The manifold was working gravity and pressure now in perfect equilibrium. Colonel O'Donnell leaned forward. "She's running smooth," he said, voice tight with disbelief. At 27,000 feet, Tokyo appeared as a grey smudge on the horizon. The Japanese had expected these bombers to come from China, not from the heart of the Pacific. Air raid sirens began to wail across the city. Flak bursts bloomed in black puffs around the leading formation. Bomb bay doors open. The metallic groan of hydraulics echoed through the fuselage. Bombardier Lieutenant Charles Phillips peered through the Norden bomb site crosshairs settling on the Nakajima factory complex. The air shimmered with heat and tracer fire. He steadied his breathing. Bombs away. The superfortress lurched upward, freed from thousands of pounds of weight. A heartbeat later, the city below erupted in flame. The first raid on Tokyo in nearly 2 years had begun. The return journey tested every calculation. Winds shifted, fuel consumption climbed, and the crews stared at their gauges as if watching their own pulse. In older configurations, some B-29s would have turned back empty, forced to ditch before reaching base. But not this time. As the formation neared Iwo Jima's position marker, O'Donnell's radio crackled. "Lead one, check your reserve tanks." The engineer's eyes widened. "Sir? We've still got 80 gallons in each main." For a moment, silence filled the cockpit. Then the colonel exhaled a slow laugh, not of joy, but of awe. The bomber had done the impossible. It had crossed the Pacific, struck Tokyo, and returned with fuel to spare. When dauntless Dottie touched down on Tinian's runway at dusk, the ground crew erupted in cheers. The men who had doubted the aircraft's endurance now stood speechless, watching its engines cool in the tropical night. The mission wasn't perfect. Some aircraft lost engines, others failed to find targets, but the message was clear. The Pacific was no longer too vast, and Japan no longer beyond reach. In Seattle, a telegram arrived at Boeing's engineering office. Fuel distribution modification confirmed success. Request replication across entire fleet. It was unsigned, marked only with the code Mariana's Command. Harold Farley read it twice before setting it down. He knew what it meant. His design had just extended the reach of a war machine that would soon define the end of the conflict. He stepped outside the hangar, staring at the night sky. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the bombers he'd helped perfect were rewriting the limits of war. By January 1945, the Pacific skies belonged to the Superfortress. Waves of B-29s now streamed from the Marianas in perfect cadence, their wings gleaming under sunlight, their range unthinkable just months before. Crews no longer feared fuel starvation over the Pacific. They trusted their aircraft, trusted the invisible network of pipes and valves that kept them alive. And yet almost no one knew the name Harold Farley. Inside Boeing's Seattle plant, the war machine never slept. Production lines moved like clockwork, riveting and welding at all hours. Technicians installed the Farley manifold, now officially redesignated as Fuel Balancing System number 7A, into every new B-29 that rolled off the line. The name was bureaucratic camouflage, stripping away the identity of the man who had birthed it. Farley received neither credit nor commendation. He wasn't an officer, not a field engineer, and his idea hadn't been submitted through official design channels. To the Army Air Forces, he was a cog in the industrial juggernaut, valuable but invisible. When the War Department issued its internal memorandum celebrating the successful optimization of long-range fuel performance, his name appeared only once, buried in a footnote under contributing design personnel. But among test pilots, Farley's reputation spread quietly. They called him the man who made the wings breathe. One evening, after a flight evaluation in Kansas, a pilot approached him. "You know, sir," the man said, "we don't have to trim her every 5 minutes anymore. You fix that." Farley smiled, almost embarrassed. "The airplane fixed itself," he replied. As 1945 dragged on, the war turned darker. With the new range B-29s carried heavier payloads including incendiaries. Cities from Nagoya to Osaka burned under their wings, and while strategy demanded destruction, Farley found himself watching the newsreels in silence. His design had made these missions possible, had doubled their reach and efficiency, but now that efficiency was measured in fire. He wasn't a politician or a soldier. He never attended the briefings where planners debated morality against victory. But each time he saw the glow of firestorms over Japan flickering on the screen, he couldn't help wondering if his own pen stroke, that tiny rerouting of aluminum lines, had unknowingly drawn a path to tragedy. By March, General Curtis LeMay's new firebombing campaign reached its apogee. Hundreds of B-29s lifted off from the Marianas in a single night, blacking out the stars. Their loads were lighter now, fewer high explosives, more incendiaries, allowing longer range and tighter formations. The Farley system made it all possible. Fuel flowed evenly through the wings, allowing precise flight paths even at low altitude. Tokyo burned for hours. The glow was visible from 150 miles away. The operation became the deadliest single air raid in history, more devastating than Dresden, more lethal than many nuclear detonations that would follow. In the aftermath, Farley was transferred to Boeing's post-war research division. He never returned to the B-29 line. His colleagues described him as quiet, even haunted. When asked about his contribution, he only said, "I made the plane fly the way it was meant to." In May 1945, the US Army sent him a formal letter of appreciation, not for innovation, but for exceptional diligence and reliability. It was the kind of recognition given to thousands of engineers, identical in wording, impersonal in tone. He placed it in a drawer and never mentioned it again. When Japan surrendered later that year, newspapers hailed the B-29 as the weapon that ended the war, the symbol of American industrial and technological might. No article mentioned the quiet mechanic from the back of the hangar who had made the impossible distance between islands and empire disappear. In the photographs of victory parades, the bombers gleamed like silver ghosts overhead. Their wings, balanced and precise, cut through the clouds that once defined the limits of human reach. And somewhere in Seattle, Harold Farley, the man whose idea had carried them there, simply walked home unnoticed while the world celebrated. Years after the war ended, the hangars at Boeing Field grew quiet again. Rows of B-29s sat under grey tarps, their polished aluminum dulled by time and dust. The world had moved on from piston engines to jet turbines, from propellers to afterburners. But in the archives, among stacks of faded blueprints and yellowed memos, Harold Farley's signature still rested in black ink on a simple schematic fuel equalization concept. Revised wing flow, March 1944. It was an unremarkable drawing at first glance, a few lines, arrows and annotations showing the path of fuel between tanks. But that page had changed the trajectory of a global war. It had bridged 1,500 miles of ocean, allowed the US to strike Japan directly, and proved that engineering, not just courage, could bend the limits of distance. Farley himself retired quietly in 1958. By then, the Air Force had already replaced the B-29 with the jet-powered B-47 and the colossal B-52 Stratofortress. New generations of engineers chased Mach speeds, swept wings and atomic payloads, yet every bomber that came after still carried the DNA of Farley's idea: balanced fuel flow, symmetrical lift, and aerodynamic harmony. The principle that fuel wasn't just weight, but motion. In interviews, veterans often described how the B-29 felt, alive in the air, stable, confident, somehow aware. They didn't know that this sensation came from a handful of aluminum lines hidden inside the wings. To them, it was just good design. To Farley, it was poetry in pressure and flow. He lived long enough to see the dawn of the space age, to watch the same company that had built his bombers design rockets for NASA. When asked once about his contribution, he smiled faintly and said, "It wasn't about war, it was about making something fly right." But the world rarely honors the invisible hands behind victory. When history books praised the B-29, they spoke of its payload, its pressurization, its range, all measured in tons, miles, and statistics. They never mentioned that one of those numbers, the most decisive of all range, had come from an after-hours sketch by a man who never sought fame. And yet traces of his work endure in every aircraft that takes to the sky. The balance of lift and fuel, the symmetry of performance, all descendants of that wartime discovery. Engineers still study the lessons of the B-29's range problem in aeronautical design courses, unaware that its solution came not from an executive order, but from a single stubborn civilian who refused to stop asking why. In the 1970s, during a Boeing retrospective exhibit, a curator found Farley's original manifold prototype, the crude assembly of tubes and valves built in secret with a few mechanics. It was displayed beside a restored B-29 engine, unnoticed by most visitors. A small brass plaque read simply, "Fuel Equalization Manifold, 1944, Originator H. Farley." One evening, a group of retired aircrew visited the exhibit. Among them was a grey-haired colonel who had flown in the Marianas raids. He stared at the manifold for a long moment before whispering, "So that's what kept us in the air." The engineer's invention had outlasted him, and perhaps that was enough. The legacy of war often hides in the smallest mechanisms, a valve, a circuit, a seam, each one a quiet act of genius buried beneath the noise of history. Harold Farley died in 1979, his obituary only a few lines long. But every B-29 that once soared across the Pacific carried his story in silence, a reminder that victory isn't just forged in strategy rooms or on battlefields, but in the restless minds of those who dream of doing something better. In the end, his idea didn't just help win a war. It made flight itself more human, efficient, enduring, and alive.